Two things, which is conflict and conflict resolution, have been the hallmarks of Sino-Indian relations ever since beginning. Whether it was the war or trade, both the countries have been at loggerheads with each other as early as maybe just about a month ago. And India wants to befriend China, and China wants to put Pakistan ahead so that the tensions along both the LAC and the LOC continue and destabilize India. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and good evening, and to this discussion today, which is on the book entitled Rising to the China Challenge, Winning Through Strategic Patience and Economic Growth. I have generally seen two or rarely three authors to a book, and here we have one, which carries the wisdom of six eminent thinkers and writers from diverse domains, half of which I have the pleasure of knowing personally for years, and the rest knowing them and reading them academically. Mr. Gautam Bambawale, Dr. Vijay Khelkar, Dr. Raghunath Mashelkar, Dr. Ganesh Natarajan, Dr. Ajit Ranade, and Dr. Ajay Shah. The discussion is moderated by Ms. Bhuvna Anand, co-founder and director, Trayas, a knowledge-driven public purpose enterprise with 16 years plus experience in public policy research and working extensively across and alongside government and civil society partners on creating an enabling environment for enterprises, regulatory simplifications, and reforming welfare programs. She's former director research at the Center for Civil Society. Our invited experts today are Dr. Niranjan Sahu, Senior Fellow ORF, who leads studies and programs on governance, democracy, electoral reforms, conflicts, and insurgencies in human rights, amongst others. Recipient of Ford Asia and Sir Ratan Tata Fellowships, Dr. Sahu is working on his forthcoming book, Funding India's Democracy, and his recent paper was on the West Wanes, China Grows. What's at stake for the liberal order? Our second expert, invited expert today is Dr. Aijaz Wani, Research Fellow, who is joined in from Srinagar, again from ORF, currently working on the project Kashmir Conflict, Managing Perceptions and Prospects for Peace. Designed in the form of questionnaires and surveys with key stakeholders, the project is based on Kashmiri youth's perspective. He's also tracking the minorities of China, radicalization in Pakistan, and gender central and greater Central Asia. Widely published in international and national journals, and he has been a fellow with the Yanjiang, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Social Science in China, and Institute of Social Science in China, and the University Grants Commission. So with this, I invite Bhuvna to take over and do the introduction to the book and our panelists today and kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Gurcharan. I hope I'm audible to everybody. Welcome to this very exciting conversation that we have planned today. As Gurcharan mentioned, we're going to talk about this fabulous book, Rising to the China Challenge. The subtitle of the book is very interesting, and I remember first hearing about the book in an earlier conversation sometime in 2020. The conversation then eventually culminated in a paper, and from that, a book came about. The subtitle is Winning Through Strategic Patience and Economic Growth, which is a unique way of thinking about foreign policy, particularly in the context of China. We have two of the authors of the book on our panel. Like Gurcharan mentioned, it's rare to find six luminaries come together and write a book. So I'm particularly excited about this conversation. So welcome, everybody. I thought I would introduce the panelists sort of as I ask the questions rather than, sort of a litany of names and credentials. So I want to start by quickly reading a little bit from the book and then beginning the panel discussion. The introduction to the book is titled Towards Less China. And I thought that was a very compelling, sort of strategic approach, if you will. Recent developments have profoundly changed the outlook on India-China relationship. For many decades, the prevailing framework was one where border, geopolitical, and military disputes were held in abeyance or compartmentalized, while parallelly, the two countries concentrated on economic development and increased trade and commercial engagement. It is now clear that this compartmentalized framework is untenable and must be discarded. What is less clear, however, is the new intellectual framework that must be adopted from the Indian perspective. What is the alternate set of policy choices? What is the new strategic perspective? It is now necessary to develop this new holistic framework in light of the irreversibly changed context. And by the irreversibly changed context, the authors refer to, of course, the pandemic and the rise of China as a challenge to Pax Americana. With this, I want to begin the conversation. Ganesh, you are one of the co-authors of the book. I just quickly will run through. Dr. Ganesh Natarajan is executive chairman and founder of 5F World. 5F World is a platform for digital startups, skills, and social ventures in the country. He is also co-founder of Global Talent Track, Skills Alpha, and Lighthouse Communities Foundation, and two Indo-US joint ventures, Calzoom Advisors and the Center for AI and Advanced Analytics. He also serves on the boards of Principal Asset Management, Hinduja Global Solutions, Educate Girls, Asian Venture Philanthropy Network, SysTech Inc., and Social Venture Partners. That's a long list of affiliations. Welcome, Ganesh, and I'm very excited to talk with you. Let's start a little bit about the book itself. This is a sort of a grand beginning to putting an intellectual framework on how to think about China. Tell us about the germination of the idea. How did the six of the sort of coolest policy minds get together and write this? The process itself must have been quite a ride. And finally, what is strategic patience as a policy approach to China? What are some of the ideas in the book that you'd like to underline in this conversation?
Sure, thanks, Bhuna, and pleasure to be on this panel. And thank you, Samir, for inviting us. And just to very quickly touch upon the 2 points you raised, and of course, my colleague and co-author Ajit will then add to that. To answer your question, how did this happen? I mean, as you very rightly articulated in your introduction, I mean, everything was chugging on parallel lines. The whole China conflict and potential problems, and of course, the economic partnership with China, which was fairly robust even then. But you'll recall that in June 2019, the unexpected happened, and China actually attacked in Ladakh. And I think there was a sense of surprise, anguish. I think the military gave a magnificent response. I mean, all credit to the Indian Army. At the same time, I think naturally a lot of knee-jerk actions followed. I mean, the ban of Chinese apps and saying that, look, we should not buy anything from China, etc., etc. And which is when, I mean, Pune International Center, as you probably know, is now a very extremely good think tank, research, event organizer, etc. And the president or the vice president of the Pune International Center, Dr. Mashelkar, who is one of our most eminent scientific administrators, as well as, of course, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, who needs no introduction. So actually, Dr. Mashelkar called me once and said that, look, Ganesh, I write a lot. So he was asking me whether I would, also being in Pune, along with Vijay and Dr. Mashelkar, coordinate a research project on what could be the response to this problem. Quite honestly, I mean, having run software and training companies throughout my life, I don't profess to be a policy wonk or anything like that. But I do know the industry substantially. And so that's really where I came in. And then, of course, we roped in Gautam Bambawale, as many of you know, been a very, very long-term ambassador, both to China and to Pakistan. And of course, my good friend here, Ajit Ranade, who doesn't know Ajit in terms of his work as an economist, as well as Aditya Birla Group. And Ajay Shah, who's a professor at Jindals and also a very, very well-known economist. So 6 of us together, and you would wonder how 6 people in COVID times can actually manage to pull together a book. But I think we were very disciplined. We used to literally meet maybe once in 10 days on Zoom and have amazingly entertaining as well as educational and informative chats. And the book evolved not as a book. Initially, we thought, let's create a policy paper, because we genuinely felt that we need to be strategic about China and not tactical or knee-jerk, as I mentioned earlier. And the policy paper was supposed to be about 10,000 words and was meant for submission to various government departments, etc. But given that all of us are prolific thinkers and writers, the first draft of the so-called policy paper went to 70,000 words because we all had a lot to say. And I was in charge of the whole industry response, of course, Ambassador Mambawale, the diplomatic response. The two economists talked about both the history, the current, and the future of what could be economic relations. And of course, our mentors, Dr. Mashelkar and Dr. Kelkar. And I think that it really turned out to be an extremely good exercise. So Ajay and I actually put together a 10,000 words from that. We kind of just culled it out. And it went to all segments of the government, got an excellent response from various people in government, including a not so excellent response from the Chinese side, which naturally people read it and said, how can you say this? And we don't mean this, etc., etc. But we won't get into that. But I think to answer your question, we said there are clearly, it's not just a military solution, because at this point, at least, militarily, we cannot really match China. We said we need to be much smarter than that. Okay, there is clearly opportunities in diplomacy in terms of working with both China's friends and enemies. And we all saw what happened when Putin came and spent 6 hours in India. So I think it's good responses. Similarly, we said that, look, there needs to be a very strong industry response. Cannot really prevent Chinese ships from prowling the Indian Ocean if we are so much inferior in so many industry segments. And we kind of did a lot of research. And if we get time, I can give you a summary of that industry response research. And of course, we also said that economically, diplomatically, and industry-wise, and of course, in areas like innovation, research, higher education, but quite honestly, I think China has left us far behind. What is the response we do? And how do we, in the foreseeable future, make that change happen? The logic being, and I just kind of share some data with you, we said that if you really look at it, in 1980, China was maybe a $305 billion economy, as against India's 189 billion. So we were fairly close. But if you look at 2019, which is at the time of writing this book, China had become 14 trillion, as against India's 2.9 trillion. But our argument is that if we do the right things, we're able to consistently grow the economy at 8% per annum, very similar to China's decades of 10% growth. Then by 2041, which is not very far away, China would probably be a $53 trillion economy. And India could grow to 40 trillion, assuming China slows down to 4 to 5%, and India kind of sustains an 8% plus. That would put us within striking range. And we said that it's probably the wish of every Indian that we can demand a seat at the highest tables of thinking by making this happen. So I think that was the excitement. The book has been extremely well received, as you know. And I think it's been an amazing journey for all of us to take it forward.
That's fantastic, Ganesh. Thank you. Ajit, why don't I come to you? And one, I want to understand your experience, of course, as part of the book writing team, the all-star book writing team, but also the point that Ajit made about, the point that Ganesh made about 2041 as a, within striking range, right? That this is a feasible idea. We can get closer and closer by this time. And what do we need to do in order for that to happen? Because if I look at the byline of the book, it says strategic patience and economic growth. So both of those, ideas. So why don't I turn the mic over to you?
Thank you, Bhuvana. Let me again join my friend Ganesh in also thanking the Scotch team, Samir Kochar, Gursharan, and all of you for inviting us. It's been great to reconnect, I think, after a long time. And good to see old friends, Sudipto and others here, Niranjan. So let me begin by what you said, the subtitle of the book, Winning Through Strategic Patience and Economic Growth. But in fact, before the subtitle, the title itself, it says Rising to the China Challenge. Please note it's rising. It's not defeating, overtaking, eliminating China. It's rising to the challenge. So recognizing that this is a new challenge. And I mean, if there's time permitting, we can go through what has happened, why this new challenge has emerged. Of course, we have a shared history. But what happened in the summer of 2020 was, a very different outcome. For the first time in 45 years, we had actually a lethal encounter. People died. We've had these established protocols to escalate matters and diffuse situations. The border has been, of course, there have been tensions, but we always had some kind of protocol to diffuse the situation, either through diplomatic channels, government to government, military, But what happened was, first lethal encounter in 45 years. But that's not just it. Prior to this, we had the issue of Doklam, a 70-day standoff, which took a lot of effort to diffuse. Before that was Depsang. So actually, last 3 or 4 years, the situation of the bilateral relations have been turning in a decisive way. I personally, and as Ganesh mentioned, we were all friends and we were talking about this, and Galwan essentially really, was, like I said, a big event. But I personally used to feel that India-China relations could be compartmentalized. It's, the economic relationship between India and China since the turn of the century was one of the most dynamic relationships in the world. Bilateral economic, commercial, growth relations were growing dynamically. Of course, asymmetrically, we can come to that later, but something like 20% growth in trade year on year. In 2001, India was destination number 19 in terms of attractiveness to Chinese exporters. By 2015, we were destination number 5 or 6. We had grown that much in importance to China. And of course, Indian companies were getting established there, pharmaceutical, we can talk about that, software. So, but now things have changed, I think, under President Xi. And when he took charge in 2013, in fact, I think, he gave us a big famous speech, and he mentioned India specifically. He had India's focused statement. And that had a lot of promise in it. Addressing, it was based on 5 principles, including addressing each other's mutual concerns, border issues, not ignoring border issues, but growing economic relationships, cultural, people-to-people contact, all those things. But what has happened in the last 3-4 years is it's not just India, many other countries have woken up that this is different. That's one. Secondly, the subtitle of the book. It says, winning through strategic patience and economic growth. So strategic patience, just as Ganesh said, it's not a tactical response, it's a strategic response, and it will work over a period of time. There can't be anything knee-jerk, there can't be anything discontinuous, there can't be anything immediate. It's going to take time. So patience. And economic growth is, of course, a very big part of our response. And the economic growth agenda is of importance in of itself. It doesn't have to be because we are responding to the China challenge. It is actually independent of this, our external situation. We have a domestic growth agenda, inclusive and sustainable growth, which we know this and we've recognized it. And it's not only these authors who have pointed it out, but in the context of the China challenge, it becomes very much more important. So that's the background to the title and the subtitle. And the book, outlines all these facets. There's a diplomatic angle. I must say that this reflects the collective thinking of the authors. Even though Ganesh said that different people worked on different aspects more in depth, but it does reflect a collective thinking of all of us. So whatever the diplomatic stance that India needs to take, and the fact that we need to build coalitions with like-minded and opportunistic. Opportunistic in the good sense of the word. That we may be in alliance with people X and Y who don't get along with each other, but X, Y, and India will need to be together on this China thing. And we need to do that. We need to now the border has become live. It was only pockets, but now the entire border is up. There will be much more vigilance, much more. Their levels of tensions may be higher. But I must say that while all this is going on, in 2020, calendar 2020, India's #1 trading partner was China. In 2021, we are in December, we have actually broken previous records. China continues to be the trading partner #1 and much more so. And India's exports to China in the last 3 years actually have been rising steadily. So that's a reality we must acknowledge. Then in the recently concluded Glasgow COP26 negotiations, India and China stood together and were able to actually tone down the language from phase out of coal to phase down of coal, because this is in our common interest. as a developing country, we need to depend on energy, and coal will continue to be an important source of energy for India. So we cannot sign up to anything which is more drastic and phasing out. So in arenas like climate change, response to climate change, or I would say even things like non-proliferation or combating terrorism. So there are many areas where actually there's scope for mutual cooperation. And therefore, so this relationship is complex. It's not so simple. And a main part of it is to reduce the asymmetry. India, in terms of its economic clout, scientific clout, military clout, technological progress, on every dimension like this, it is far behind China. We need to accept that. But that doesn't mean that it's a given. It's not going to be static. And if India focuses, it's on this aspect that in the next 15 years, perhaps 15 to, if we focus on getting on a path of high and sustainable and inclusive growth, the gap will be narrowed, and it will considerably change the dynamics between the two countries. And the book spells out what we need to do, but we can get into the details later. But it's not something that has not been known. I mean, Mr. Sudipta Mundal is here, and he, among many others, have pointed out what India needs to do in terms of getting higher growth orbit. So economic growth is a big part of our response to China.
So I want to pick up on that with Sudipta, but just right before that, Ganesh, if I might come back to you, just to take a minute or two and just talk about what is the China challenge, right? The border incursions are sort of one element in a build-up and a changing world order in some sense. So what is this China challenge that we're really contending with?
I think to answer your question, the China challenge, and I think Ajit has alluded to that. I mean, today, I think Xi Jinping is going in a certain direction, which could provide a wedge of opportunity for all of us, because obviously America is very worried about China and the whole demolition of Jack Ma and startups, etc. I mean, a lot of people are watching it and seeing where it will go, which is actually an opportunity for India. But if you look at the classical China response, I'm a great fan of China, by the way. Built a very successful 2 companies in China. One was when I was running Aptech. We had one of the best joint ventures with Beijing University, which actually became the market leader in 1 year's time. That's the scale at which China operates. And similarly in software, 2 separate companies, one in Shanghai, one in Tianjin. So I think I'm thoroughly impressed by the professionalism by which they work. However, having said that, there's always Big Brother watching you, and we all know what it is to build that. But I think China's challenge is that extreme focus. And today, I mean, while we all think, I mean, if you look at the history, China created 13 million jobs every year by just moving people from agriculture to industry. And whether it was the chemical SEZs, the huge electronics capabilities they did, I mean, almost took away from Taiwan. So I think China's ability to scale is absolutely unbelievable. I still remember visiting the city of Suzhou, which is not far from Shanghai. And somebody just told the mayor that I was coming and I was running this software company. And he said, after lunch, he said, let me take you to the Zensar facility in Suzhou. I said, what do you mean by that? He actually took me to a building. Outside, they had actually got Zensar technologies written on it. Inside was fully done up. He said, all you have to do is hire 2,000 people and you can start tomorrow. I mean, you cannot imagine this happening in India. So in that scale, if you look at even today, if you look at the recent rebalancing of economic growth they're doing, I mean, they've already realized that they have to move from export orientation, which they kind of milked to the hilt, to domestic drivers, move from investment, which was a primary method, to today consumption as the biggest component of economy, moving away from industry, as I mentioned, to more of services, moving away from what used to be called old economy or dirty industries like metals, mining, chemicals, where they won their spurs and became the kind of factory for the world. But today their focus is all on renewables, electric cars, green industries. And I think that's something to watch out for. And finally, if you look at the research, I mean, I would think that in artificial intelligence, the city of Tianjin spends more or invests more than probably India does as a country. So these are the real challenges. That how do you contend with an extremely fast-moving, extremely dynamic administration which can make stuff happen because of as all of you know, the mayors of the cities are almost like prime ministers in themselves. So in that context, given the fact that we have a liberal, very robust democracy, the real challenge is competing against that. And I don't know whether the temporary advantage of Xi Jinping will last. But clearly, we have to get our act in place.
So can I just, Boona,
Please,
I just
please.
want to add to what Ganesh said, since you asked about the China challenge. See, another source of the challenge is our import dependency on China, and in some very critical and strategic sectors. For example, if you look at electronics, as recently as last year, I think 45% of electronics imports are coming from China. And that just not just mobile phones, but a whole range of electronic products. If you look at capital goods, machinery, including our power sector, 32%. Organic chemicals, 38% comes from China. Then even things like, consumer goods like furniture, bedding, you go to this big wholesale, it's coming from China, 57%. 28% of fertilizer. India has a huge fertilizer dependence on the world. 1/3 of our fertilizer consumption, which is very crucial to India's agriculture. And in fact, the Prime Minister also made some statements about fertilizer. 28% comes from China. Automotive parts, 25%. And most importantly, in the times of pandemic, 68% of pharmaceutical APIs, the pharmaceutical intermediates, come from China. In fact, I'm told even things like, air condition, the compressors, or the front-loading washing machines, some very high percentage, 80, 90%. Of course, some of the domestic initiatives like the PLI, production-linked incentives, is trying to address this. So since you had asked, Ganesh, I think another element of this China challenge, how do we reduce this import dependency on China? I mean, this is something that other countries also face, but in light of our relationship right now, which needs to be, redefined, or that's to be reoriented. Reducing import dependency is also a big part of the challenge.
That's great. That's really helpful. Sudipta, I want to come to you next, and just sort of, in a sense, the book's big message is also a little bit look inward, right? And to borrow an idea from the book, the best foreign policy is to get a next block of high growth from like the kind we got from 1991 to 2011, right? I think in another book, two of the authors write, we need to grow rich before we grow old. And these are all sort of, I think, ideas that come together. As a senior economist who people listen to, what would your advice on getting there be? What is it that we need to do in order to get rich before we get old, to get that kind of period of high growth over long periods of time?
Yeah, I'll come to that. But if I may take a few minutes to link this importance of high growth, which Ajit emphasized, to where we are today in our unequal relationship with China. The numbers have been mentioned, 14 trillion versus 2.7 trillion, similar in per capita, etc., etc. You look at our defense capability compared to theirs, our science and technology compared to theirs, we are far, far behind in everything. So it's a no-brainer that if you want to face this challenge, you will need time. It's not going to happen overnight. And what you're going to do with this time exactly is have high growth, not just high in absolute term, but high relative to China, because there's no other way of reducing the distance between India and China. And that is what we really need to do. And I must say in this context that this book, excellent, timely, very rich in material and lots of thoughts. And I'll just talk about a few things out of this book in terms of growth, but also related aspects, which to me are the most important takeaways for facing the China challenge. One very important, I think the central idea of the book, if I have understood right, is that you have to play the long game, as I was just saying. I mean, you can't face China in the short run. You're talking about being capable of meeting, rising to their challenge, as the book says, in a period of, say, 25, 30 years. But what happens in the interregnum, and I think as Ajit mentioned, the intermediate period is also extremely important.
Okay.
And that is these coalitions. Coalitions with the advanced countries who today, I will come to this later, but I think Xi Jinping was premature in announcing his rise to hegemony, which Deng never did. And it has alerted the Western, advanced countries, and they're all beginning to coalesce to contain the not the rise, but the attempt of China to essentially dominate the world. So that's one set of countries. Then there are, of course, China's own neighbors in Southeast Asia, whether it's Korea, China, Taiwan in the north, or Vietnam in the south, who all have concerns, Philippines and so on, as we do as bordering countries. We have lots of shared interests with them. And then, of course, our own neighbors, whether it is Nepal or Bhutan, Bangladesh, I would say even Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and so on. And I just want to make a point here that in our own interest, it's high time that we dramatically ramped up our relationship with these neighboring countries and the assistance we provide to them. And in a sense, if possible, lock them into a very deep, engaged relationship with ourselves in our own interest. Because if we don't do that, the Chinese will do. We cannot compete with China in terms of aid to the rest of the world. But at least in our own neighborhood, we should match what the Chinese give, if possible, exceed it, and give them an interest, give them a skin in the game of India's success. I mean, that is very, very important. But leaving that aside, now moving to the question that you were really asking me about what is to be done. Here again, there is a lot that we have to learn from the Chinese. But let me just make one point, and I'm not sure whether there's a difference of views or maybe just difference in nuances on the existing engagement with China. Yeah. As Ajit mentioned, they are our biggest trading partners and if anything, getting bigger by the day. We have a huge trade deficit with them, of course, and they're also big investors in this country. So we can't just disengage with them. It's going to hurt us, these knee-jerk type of reactions. However, I think the book mentions, there's no need to disengage in building a little highway from point A to point B. But when it comes to some strategic areas, I think it is important to disengage, and I'll mention only three. One is rare earths. The whole world, and certainly India, is dependent on them because the Chinese have virtually had a monopoly. But I'm very pleased to find that the rest of the world has woken up to this, and China's dominance today is down to about half of global exports of rare earths. We should diversify our sources of imports on this, if possible, invest in our large coastline, the sand, coastal area and so on, to reduce our dependence on China for rare earths. Then the active pharmaceutical ingredients, which Ajit mentioned. Again, we saw, there was a time when we were running out of drugs during the COVID period because we were not being able to import enough of the intermediate of China, which again had a monopoly in the world. This is again something, diversification, and leave it to the Indian market if our investors feel that this is something that they can invest in, that we would develop our own capacity. And the third area, of course, is telecoms and electronics, as again Ajit mentioned. These are some strategic areas where tomorrow, if relations deteriorate further, the Chinese could actually have a choke us, and that is where we need to get away from that dependence. But apart from that, I think we need to learn a lot from them in terms of what is to be done. How did China become the factory of the world? How did they grow from more or less equal sizes to about 8 times our manufacturing production and so on? Three things, and these are all thoughts I picked up in the book, 3 or 4 thoughts. One is the special economic zones. It's not as though we have not tried special economic zones, but the way the Chinese went about it, as their own saying goes, cross the river by treading on the stones. They've started with a few areas in the north. When it worked, they spread to the whole of the eastern seaboard, and now it's the whole country. We have not succeeded in doing that very well. So there's a lot to learn on exactly how you make these things happen. And then FDI, an extremely FDI-friendly regime, both in terms of course, their very competitive, undervalued exchange rate, which is difficult. Of course, we are not going to manipulate our exchange rates, but our exchange is actually overvalued, and that should be allowed to, depreciate much faster. But also our taxes on imports, as well as our domestic taxes. If you're going to compete with the world and China, all in particular, you have to have a tax regime which is also competitive. You can't get your industrialists to fight this battle with, sort of one hand tied behind their backs. The third aspect of this, of course, is infrastructure. It's proverbial, our backwardness. And look at the Chinese today, they're not just global standards, they're actually leading the world in many of these things, whether it's high-speed trains or the expressways or, internet broadband or ports, airports, and so on. So infrastructure, this SEZ's FDI infrastructure is really the key to, I think, their big success in getting where they have today based on the back of rapid growing manufacturing. And that is what we should, that is where I think we can emulate them, but learn how to do these things. In addition to that, where they have been very good, I think, the Chinese, is in a very nimble ability to change policies when the need arose. Sure. We have not been very good at that. They try something, there's no ego hassle there. When they feel that something not working, they very quickly change. And being the command and control system they are, the message comes down from the top and very quickly everything adjusts. So this flexibility, as you know, in terms, in the 12th 5-year plan, the 13th, now the 14th plan, they have been shifting away from export-led growth to domestic demand-led growth, from investment to consumption, to new sets of industry from the old or dirty industries, as Ganesh was mentioning. So all these changes are happening. It's already been in process for over a decade now, but it's going on, being quite nimble in making the adjustments. Of course, they run into problems, but this is again something that we have something to learn from them. And just in passing, the Belt and Road project, it's diplomatically, of course, very important for them, but it is also a fantastic, very clever way of making their own adjustment internally. Because China is a country with excess capacity in capital goods, in steel, cement, etc., machinery, etc., and a surplus of capital. So what do? You lock your neighbors, and actually people not that nearby either, by lending them money to buy from you your projects, your steel, your cement, and you get to use capacity, which is, it's a huge overcapacity problem in these industries. So these are some of the things that we have to learn from their success, but we should also learn from our failures. And I think there's a beautiful set of, 9 or so case studies in the book, detailed discussions, which I think are very, very valuable, because you learn from them, whether it is in, let's say, chemicals or consumer electronics and so on. Why did they leave us standing still virtually, and they just rushed ahead? What were these little nitty-gritty things? This is not big strategic things, but these are little day-to-day measures, implementation measures that they took, which made it happen. And this is again something we are not good at, and this is something we need to learn from them, how to do these little things. That being said, now in terms of how do we get that growth advantage, I want to focus on 2 things. One is the matter of institutions. The book places a lot of institutions, a lot of emphasis on institutions as a key weakness in China, and I completely agree with that. The authoritarian regime and increasing authority is now costing China. And the best way to underline this point is to compare what I call the golden period of modern China under Deng, from around late 80s to around 2012. This was a period, decades of double-digit growth. It's never happened any time in history. They managed to do it. And this is when they left us and the whole world standing behind. But along with this, what has probably not been adequately noticed is that Deng also took measures, of course, within a one-party state, to liberalize within that system, in the sense of sharing power within their power structure, in terms of restraining the power of the one leader at the top, in terms of fixing his period of rule and so forth. And that continued until Xi Jinping came to power now. So there, I would say, a dramatic change in the institutional situation of China. You had the Mao period with one great leader. You had the Deng period, the golden period, when, China changed a lot. And I've gone back to something like the Maoist period under Xi Jinping. And in my view, a premature announcement of his desire to, be hegemonic in the world, which has alerted the whole world, which is now reacting. But also during this period, China's growth rate has not been that high. It's been, coming down. And this is the thing that we should take advantage of. Meaning what? We have to take advantage of institutional reforms. If I may put it, the Chinese have a very exclusive or extractive political system. However, if you look at their socio-economic system, it is far more inclusive than ours. Whether you attribute it to our thousands of years old caste system, whatever. Just yesterday, the report came out from Piketty and others, but most of us have known it for a long time. India is one of the most unequal societies in the world, especially in terms of wealth, not just in terms of consumption expenditure, which is what NSS surveys normally give you. Now, this we need to fix. So there's this misalignment. The Chinese need to align their authoritarian political system to a more inclusive socio-economic system. We need to adjust our exclusive socio-economic system to a political system of democracy. Not ideal, but it works, so that we become a holistically more inclusive society. And here, I have a feeling that it's much more difficult for the Chinese to do it, especially with a guy like Xi Jinping in charge. And we might steal advantage. If we can do our reforms towards a more egalitarian society, which we can do, it's a matter of the political will to do it. And certainly it will get a lot of political mileage for any party that initiates that program. That could give us that kind of growth advantage that I was talking about. And one final point is on demography. This is, again, a big Achilles heel of China. The aging population. We have a big advantage because of our young workforce and our low dependency ratio. However, our demographic advantage, or what we call the demographic dividend, can very easily turn into a demographic disaster unless we do what it takes to actually take advantage of this potential situation. And that means high investment, certainly in health. I mean, COVID has taught us that, but also in education. You can have any number of skilling programs that you want, but you can't skill a workforce unless they have a basic, robust education foundation. They cannot pick up the skills. And n number of studies where Asser and others have told us this story. So we need to invest far more, not just in higher education, certainly we should do that, and in innovation and research and so on, which again, we are far beyond the Chinese, but also in relatively, not so glamorous things like simple basic education, because that is the foundation. And you look at China, Ganesh and others have spent time there, you will find that their population are much better educated, the mass I'm talking about. Within that, of course, once you have that, you have privileged, not privileged, but in well-endowed, extra intelligent students who then get onto a fast track and end up in a university like Tsinghua and so on, competing with the rest of the world. So this is, I would like to just end on that note, that no country has risen or caught up with other leading countries without that investment in basic education and health. And this is not a soft thing. It is at least as important as investing in infrastructure. So let me stop on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ajit, I have one quick follow-up. There are so many threads that Sudipto's points have opened up, but there's one that I wanted to pick up with you. There are clearly a set of reform ideas that are playing on several people's minds, right, including yours. And I know this has been, sort of talked about to death, but 5 headline reforms that we have to do today. so that we can, play this game of 20, 25 years and get on this path of creating jobs and growth and so on?
Well, one headline has been playing in India for the last 12 months, which is agriculture, right? So clearly, unshackling agriculture, we don't have time to go into all the details, but we need to first of all accept and acknowledge that agriculture continues to be extremely regulated and extremely shackled. Say for example, half the output, 40% of the output is done by tenant farmers, but tenancy laws are very restricting. There's so much price control on inputs, outputs, exports, imports. Agriculture credit doesn't, not even half the farmers get agriculture credit, formal credit. They get it through money lenders or relatives. So we could go on and on. So agriculture is one area, big area that needs to be really unshackled. Secondly, in general, the factor markets, we've done well on the industrial licensing was removed. Banking was deregulated, but on the factor markets, land and labor, a lot of reforms are still, not even begun, or there's a lot needs to be done. Third, I think is commitment to openness. India is not going to grow at a high rate of 8% inclusive growth unless we tap into global markets. And to tap into global markets, you need to be committed to the principle of openness. You can't build protectionist walls. In fact, the name of the game now is to be part of global value chains. If we have free trade agreements or alliances, it's going to be production is going to be spread across many countries. And therefore, we need to look at sectors where we have an employment intensive part of the value chain. So we should focus on employment creation and not value addition, which has been the traditional norm. When we look at FTAs, we want 35% value addition, but we should rather look at the short point is that when you're committed to openness, you need to be open to ideas of participating in global value chains and having low tariff barriers, both for imports and exports. So principle of openness. Fourth point is, I think, an acknowledgement that this growth is going to be led by the private sector. It's not going to be the public sector. For example, right now we have the National Infrastructure Pipeline, which envisages 110 lakh crores of investment in the next 5 years. It's almost more than 20 lakh crores per year. But that is largely going to come from the private sector. We need to understand. So are we creating conditions where the private sector feels enthused and confident about investing? Private investors, whether they're domestic or foreign, what they look for are policies which are stable, continuous. They look for stability, continuity, and predictability. For example, we had almost 25 to 30,000 crores of private investment committed to solar power in Andhra Pradesh. And solar power, the way it works is that you put up the private investment upfront, thousands of crores, and you collect your revenues over a 20-year period through what are called PPAs, power purchase agreements, which are tariffs which are fixed. And these PPAs are with governments typically. What happened is the government changed, and the next government simply said, we are canceling all these contracts because and then the case, people had to run to the Prime Minister's office. It's in Supreme Court. So, this is a classic example of unstable policies. And there are many examples recently. So, I've given you, I think, 5 areas. I hope, let's see, let me recount: agriculture, factor markets, principle of openness, private sector-led, conditions, and investor stability, continuity, stability. I could go on, ease of doing business, in a genuine sense, not just a tick mark. By the way, we take great pride of having moved from 142 rank to 63 or something. And guess what happens next? The World Bank scraps the whole damn thing. They said it's because it was open to gaming.
Yes.
It was vulnerable to gaming. And I hope we didn't do all that gaming. But basically, ease of doing business, we were gaining rank. But for the last 5 years before 2019, we were actually steadily declining in our growth rate. Investment to GDP ratio was stagnant. So much for the EODB rank improvement. So I'm saying there are many areas, but I hope I've given you the flavor of what all needs to be done.
Rajiv, therein lies the catch, right? I feel like most people are in agreement about the package of what needs to happen. But public persuasion, as we've seen in the case of agriculture, still remains a big challenge. That Please go ahead.
I don't agree at all that it was a problem of the communication. Of course, we need to follow a process, because if you're going to introduce some drastic, supposedly game-changing reforms, even though if they have been known for a long time, you can't push them through an ordinance, and
Sure.
that too in the middle of the pandemic.
I completely agree.
So there is a role for parliamentary debate, which is not just ceremonial or just a token. A lot of these issues get highlighted. Since you have given me this, provoke me, give me 2-3 minutes.
Please.
Each of these 3 laws, I can just tell you, all these 3 laws which were introduced which were enlarging the freedoms of the farmers. Okay, the first law said you can sell your stuff in the mandi or outside the mandi, more freedom. The second law says that the storage and hoarding limits will no longer be ECA dilution, more freedoms. The third law says you can enter into contracts with corporate buyers, institutional buyers, or not, more freedoms. Who can be against more options and more freedom? What it did not say is that, number one, it says that you can sell in the mandi or outside the mandi. Wait a minute, is the mandi system going to be whittled down eventually? Does that mean the infrastructure which guarantees payments like MSP, or at least the mandi fellow cannot cheat you on weights and quantities or price payment? Is that going to be eventually whittled down? What is going to happen? Does that mean that MSP option is going to go away? It was silent on that. The parliamentary discussion would have enlarged on the discussion. Second, ECA dilution. We said free market pricing will be allowed. In the same week that Parliament passed this law, the government imposed a ban on export of onions. Why? Because onion prices were going up. If they're going up, they're good for the farmers. So such is the level of confidence. Can we have confidence in this? Third, when you say you can enter into contracts with corporates, but you say if there's a contract dispute, you don't have a right to go to court. The district magistrate will decide on this. And we had images of a district magistrate in Gurgaon ordering the breaking of skulls of farmers. Does that inspire confidence of the farmers that the DM will look after their interests? So don't say that this was just a problem of communicating to the farmers.
No, I don't think that was my implication, Ajit. And your points are very well taken. But if I take the example of the new labor codes, right? There we're already seeing, even though those went through a process that was different than the agricultural story, we're seeing a backlash currently.
Both labor and agriculture are state subjects, by the way. So anyway,
absolutely, yeah. I'm fully a votary, but I still think there is a part of a communication story, just in terms of that some quarters
communication to me gives me, it's just like as advertisement and communication. It's consultation, not communication. Yes, it's a C word. Sure. Communication and consultation.
Yes, sure, consultation. That's a much better phrase. Sure, absolutely. And openness in being able to engage through the parliamentary process and other processes. Maybe we can change track a little bit away from the economic growth story, even though that's clearly a big part of our challenge, is to talk about the coalition building thread that I think Sudipto opened up. And Priyanka, I want to quickly bring you in here. I want to talk a little bit about one of the themes in the book is that India needs to build coalitions and look for like-minded and value-similar countries that you can begin to build alliances with, think together with, and so on, and launch sort of a challenge, if you will, to China. But in some ways, China has already beat us to this, right? They've been doing this via the Belt Road Initiative, via all of their other engagements with our sort of neighbors, trade partners, and adversaries, and have been engaging in this over the last decade or so. You've studied international coalitions, particularly by BRICS countries. What are the perils of China's global coalition building strategy for us? But also, what should our coalition building strategy be?
Thank you, Bhuvna, for these questions. So firstly, thank you, Scotch Group and Mr. Kocher for the kind invitation. It is indeed a privilege to be part of this August panel and discussion of a remarkable book, very useful, timely, and extremely readable and accessible, which not only captures the concerns and anxieties in India-China relationship, goes beyond the usual rhetoric, but also provides us with a wide menu of policy options about how to manage China, if not resolving the differences, because that's not going to happen, as the authors rightly mentioned. Resolving, of course, that will be part and parcel of any negotiation, for that matter, bilateral, multilateral, plurilateral. Okay, so talking about coalition building, China's coalition building strategy, before I come to India's response and the perils of it, let me talk a little bit about what has been the drivers of China's coalition building strategy so far. So it has always been a central component of China's foreign policy from the mid-1990s. I say mid-1990s because it was when China made its application to join the World Trade Organization. It was when China was seeking an active integration with the global economy. That's where we see active pursuit of coalitions, bilateral, to be able to be part of plurilateral, regional, multilateral, and all of that. And the nature of these coalitions, of course, have evolved over time, especially the means through which these coalitions were struck. But the long-term goal, of course, if you look at the long-term goal, there we see a continuity, more or less remained the same, and which was to advance Chinese leadership. Of course, the gradation, we have seen gradation because Deng Xiaoping said, feel the stones while crossing the river. That is, bide your time and hide your strength, okay? But then in case of Xi Jinping, we are seeing a much more aggressive pursuit of foreign policy. So a coalition building, which has become a foreign policy priority, and Xi Jinping is pursuing it aggressively. And most far-reaching of it, of the initiative in this direction, is the Belt and Road Initiative. The objective is to recreate this ancient maritime overland Silk Roads connecting China to the rest of the Asia, Middle East, Europe, all of that. And Mr. Moonley rightly mentioned that, of course, China has a hidden objective. Now, the objective is very much out in the open, which is reallocation of China's large foreign exchange assets away from low-yield US Treasury bonds to high-yield infrastructure investments, creating alternate markets for Chinese goods. And along that, in the BRI, for BRI projects, for funding BRI projects, we've also seen how China has spearheaded creation of multilateral institutions, the AIIB, the NDB. NDB, of course, is part of the BRICS, but we know that in any kind of regional grouping, leadership is important, who advances the interests of the group, and China has taken that kind of leadership in NDB, in BRICS. And these institutions, of course, part of these multilateral, minilateral groupings, regional groupings, but China played a very important role, and Chinese influence, of course, in these institutions. We have seen, again, China deepening its influence in these institutions. Now, coming to Africa, Latin America, we have seen how China has also deepened their influence in these region, being a largest provider of financing for these countries, where China Development Bank, the CDB, offering more loans than the World Bank in 2018. Then, and if you look at these coalition building strategies in Africa, or in Africa per se, the rhetoric or the motivation with which China has sold the projects is within the context of these old non-aligned movement and Bandung spirit, trying to depict its current dealings, of course, which Africa as a win-win cooperation, portraying that Africa's current relationship with the West has been more of an aid-donor relationship, and China is trying to deviate from that. And China's credo of course, the non-interference in domestic affairs and separation of business and politics in Africa has been music to the ears of African leaders, and we see who fall over each other to sing praises of Chinese cooperation with their countries. And what has happened as a result? Indeed, within mere a decade, more Chinese have come to live in Africa, and a number of Chinese entrepreneurs in this region are also practicing. We have seen them engaging in a lot of malpractices, for example, gunning down of local workers in Zambia, imposing these appalling working conditions on the African employees, and not much state-level resistance because of that kind of tacit alliance that China has been able to enter with the African leaders, especially the elite groups. And these coalition building in Africa, most parts of the African, China does not discriminate when it comes to the African states. It is done through economic reward, but increasingly, of course, we have seen it has been done through these indirect, implicit and sophisticated campaigns to win the hearts and minds of today's and tomorrow's African elites. Latin American case is a little tricky because Latin America, China finds itself caught between the intensifying rivalry with the US, because US has a dominant influence in that region, and Latin America also faces some uncomfortable choices in geopolitics, in commerce. But then, nonetheless, China has emerged, in fact, as region's best commercial client. And then Central and Eastern Europe, the story is again somewhat similar. There, China has taken advantage of local vulnerabilities, weaknesses like fragile state institutions, elite capture, weak civil society, to exert its own economic, political, and soft power influence. Now, one of the important implications for global politics of these kind of cultivation of coalition of developing countries and somewhat developed countries, it provides Beijing an incentive to side with countries in dispute with the Western countries. So that's what China has been able to capitalize on. So China is expected to step up symbolic and acts of solidarity with developing countries facing Western pressure, for example, Russia for that matter. If you look at the China-Russian partnership, they are aligned. That's an issue-based alliance, and most of these alliances, they come together when Russia faces increasing Western pressure. Similarly, China has also stepped up its oil buying from Iran, defying US sanctions and all of that. But the coalition building story is, of course, not without challenge. China faces resilience, a lot of constraints, a lot of backlash, especially if you look at these BRI loans. More than half of these loans to BRI are tied. They have lots of strings attached. Tied means that they must be used for procurement from Chinese companies, which is again deeply, deeply problematic, and it keeps beating on BRI projects closed and opaque. China inflates their value, leaving countries struggling to repay their debts, and also imposes these harsh conditions on these debtor countries when they run into financial problems, seizing their strategic assets, which we have seen in case of Hambantota, in Sri Lanka, in Hambantota area. And then the other problem is with the COVID pandemic, there's been a greater disillusionment about Beijing's ability to deliver on the promises or the specific terms of certain investment deals. Even friendly governments are more skeptical of China now, and they're keener on reaffirming their ties with the traditional partners, United States and EU. And at the local level, Chinese projects, for example, in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in South Asia, in Bangladesh, have also faced a lot of pushback from subnational actors like trade unions, workers. Of course, the COVID stigma played a very important role. Chinese workers were not allowed to come back after the first phase in China was over. So there was a lot of local level opposition to Chinese workers resuming work in many of the BRI projects. Besides these kind of stigmatization, there are other problems as the opposition, of course, related to the land acquisition and all of that related to the projects. Now, what can India do? Now, India, of course, faces critical strategic choices. And that's what the book has done, a wonderful job of providing us with a wide menu of options, of various wide angles of entry into the matter. And India situates itself. So the challenge is how India can situate itself between regional responsibilities and global ambitions. Now, one of this is, of course, we have seen in case of Quad, the like-minded coalition upholding the rules and norms of current order, existing institutions, augmenting existing institutions, ensuring that there's a freedom of navigation, trade, connectivity, all of that. And Quad in this context, where in case of Quad, we see both an enmeshing of, it's a space where we see coming together or intertwining of both regional interests and global interests. It's a space where we have the regional and the global sort of interacting continuously. And their Quad can provide a long-term strategy to deter China in the region, especially given that Chinese strategy has been less about security encirclement and more about economic enmeshment. So their Quad can play a very important role. And then about China, a key player in the global supply chain, of course, Dr. Ranade mentioned and in detail that how India, of course, can build up its economic muscle. While doing that, India cannot hurt itself. It cannot actually forge a path of Atmanirbharta in the beginning, because we still have not been able to upgrade our endowment structures, most importantly. An endowment structure is not the cheap labor or the land. It is also the human capital and the technological capital that we're looking at present. So that remains a challenge for us. But what India can do in the region, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, South Asia, of course, is much more complex because it's a region of subnational actors. And if we make it Southern Asia, then China comes into the entire scene, and the entire setting changes, that who leads the region and all of that. So in South Asia and in Southeast Asia, India can actually build partnerships and more towards human development, how to ensure aligned and mutually supportive actions across all SDGs, and unlock the productive potential, for example, of the maritime assets, marine assets, blue economy, and all of that. How to share information related to marine economy, illegal fishing, and all of that. And the adoption of the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific is an iteration of how a currently divided organization like ASEAN also wants to be part of the Indo-Pacific discourse. So a lot of potential for India to act, to be able to play an important role through the entire Indo-Pacific coalition. About the GVCCS, of course, Dr. Ranade had alluded to it in greater detail. Just one point about China Plus One strategy, which the book also talks about, that yes, China Plus One strategy is feasible, but we have also seen that most of the discussions and debates about reshoring, moving away from China and all of that, the global value chains, is not going to happen in the short to medium term. It's going to take time. What is threatening currently is what appears as a major threat to the GVCs is the digitization, and how India will be able to catch up as far as the automation, robotics into manufacturing, something that we have to wait and watch. Because and a very important quote from the book that I would like to refer to here is that not merely does India have to buy to make better, but also have to buy better. Mm-hmm. And there, of course, the allusion is to the technological learning, that we really cannot wait for our firms to learn, as in acquire technology, then move up the learning curve, because it's going to take time. Just not having engineers or capital is enough for a firm to grow technologically. So till that happens, we really can't wait. We'll have to also compromise somewhere and buy technology. And for that, coalition is very important. So I would like to end here. Thank you.
Thanks, Priyanka. Ganesh, can I invite you to comment a little bit more based on the book on this coalition building strategy? Particularly
one is the coalition building strategy. But before that, I think Priyanka, what you said was fantastic in terms of just a roundup of opportunities. I mean, you didn't mention Quad, but I think that's one beginning that we've made. But apart from that, even what you just said, automation, and I think where India sometimes goes wrong is trying to emulate another example, but way too late. So even the whole Make in India, I think it was flawed, because what India didn't require was GE setting up a fully automated factory in Chakan near Pune. What it needed was job opportunities for huge numbers of people. I mean, I was speaking at the Horasis Dialogue in Ho Chi Minh City just before the pandemic hit. And the Bangladesh guy was laughing at us, saying that, look, I mean, we caught you napping in textiles. And look at it. I mean, we have so much of labor that must be put to work. We have 400 million people to deploy on jobs. So we can't just be looking at automation. So that is one point, which is why if you look at our book, we've actually clearly articulated sectors I mean, I think Sudipto mentioned the whole concept of rare earths. Okay, rare earths, we have to play a defensive strategy. We have to be Atmanirbhar. But if you look at telecom, where China did such visionary stuff, 4 large companies competing with each other to a certain extent, and India was really lagging behind. Okay, today, thanks to Reliance Jio, we're getting somewhere. But I think what we have done is we've articulated sectors where we can truly come from behind and catch up and conquer. I mean, you look at IT services, which is an industry that I've spent my entire life in. Clearly, we did much better than China. Okay, maybe you could argue English-speaking manpower, etc. But we kind of left out a huge 90% segment called the ICT. I mean, Internet, Information Communications Technology and Telecom. So there's an opportunity for us to play in that. There's an opportunity. Okay, we've seen announcements about partnering with Taiwan and creating the fab and the fabulous semiconductor projects. We need to do that. So I think there are some few strategic areas. Could be autonomous connected electric vehicles, okay, which again, of course, there is a battery dependence on China at this point, till the whole hydrogen economy kicks in. But we have to identify automobile components. We have to identify the ICT layer. Each one of these is $1 trillion opportunities. So I think we have to be strategic in that. And I think we need to avoid replicating what China did 20 years ago, because that opportunity no longer exists. Much more innovative, more farsighted. But to your point, Bhuvna, on coalitions, I completely agree with Priyanka, so I don't really want to add to that. And I think, again, Sudipto mentioned this earlier, that, I mean, we may not have the money or the intent to do this around the world, but for heaven's sake, at least those 4 or 5 countries where we can match or exceed China's investment appetite is extremely important. Otherwise you're like encircled by countries who are leaning towards China because of the sheer economic difference between what we do for them and what China does for them. I mean, just to conclude, I was talking to a very close friend of mine who's a pop singer from Pakistan called Zebunisa Bangash. And she was telling me that, look, I mean, I was asking her, how come you guys don't experience COVID? This was last year. And she said, we all got COVID in August, September of 2019, before they had pronounced it as COVID. So she said, there are so many Chinese guys floating around Karachi and Lahore that we all have got something. And she said it in Hindi. She said, we all got 2 hafte ke zukham. And we didn't know what the 2 hafte ke zukham was. But she said, that's the reason why Pakistan never had a problem of COVID, because you called it COVID way after we had all recovered. So, I mean, the reason I'm saying this stupid anecdote is it shows you the extent of involvement of China in our neighbors. And totally agree with you, whether it's the port of Colombo or wherever else, we've got to get much more strategic about partnerships.
Great. And this would be a great time to ask Niranjan from the ORF to step in as well. Niranjan, are you still with us?
Yeah, very much.
Hi.
And thanks. It's been so engrossing, actually. I mean, listening to what Mr. Natarajan said, and Ajit, of course, Dr. Mundle and Priyanka give a kind of touch. I think it's been a very fascinating discussion. I think I didn't miss even a second, actually, and learned probably a lot, because I'm not really hardcore China expert, but since I double on democracy and governance, so I actually end up spending almost a year to produce a long paper on Chinese threat to democracy and basically on liberal order. In the process, I covered many areas that been discussed for last 1.5 hours. So a couple of things that I would like to flag off, since I have not read the book, but whatever I gathered from this discussion. One thing I'm curious, actually, when we look at the kind of a vast, I would say, that inequality in national power between China and India, and that gap which continues to grow actually every year. One thing we actually, even if we analyze hardcore economics, trade and many other things, I think one thing that probably we should not miss is about comparing the two political systems. Because they are two different political systems. One is a very, very noisy, chaotic democracy and deeply federal country where, as Ajit said, states actually are the one who actually take up most of the things. And each state has its own political dynamics. And state have also incentive to push reforms, because in certain way, a lot of things are actually centered around political finance, the political funding. In fact, a lot of reforms actually in this country has not taken the year, because you have a clear linkages of, big business or other funding, certain type of, kind of policies. And many of our policies are stuck. So that's one thing. How do we actually, how do we compare two different systems? Because one is a highly centralized system, where the Politburo decides and it goes and they have to just implement. There is no question asked. For instance, the agriculture policy that we talk, at least in parliament, we had some noise and some other thing, but you never hear in, China when they do a reforms, or when they abolish their property right and when they reintroduce. So that is one. I think these aspects need to figure out, because this is where actually the problem lies. We are a deeply, open society. Despite, democratic backsliding and other things, we still have that taste. Second issue is about Chinese state characteristics. It's a kind of, I would say revisionist state. It's a middle kingdom syndrome. It might be a big, giant. It's like a 14 trillion gorilla, but it also suffers from identity crisis. It's a deeply inward looking state. Actually, it doesn't trust anybody, and wherever it has got opportunity, it has actually tried to show its actually power. When you look at even the kind of relationship it built with Japan to benefit from the investment and other thing for decades, and then when it became powerful, it started as asserting. And same thing you look at with India. Strategic patience, what you call, I would say it's like a security kind of detained it put, but today it is showing a different kind of way. So for a country of our size and ambition, we do not want to be a kind of revisionist power like China, the thing, but we have our own, kind of responsibility and historical trajectory. So where do we actually really match with a China? There, what Priyanka said about coalition building, other thing, this Quad or getting closer to US, other thing, are very smart moves, other thing. At least in the short run, we can, checkmate China, the things that is happening in the border. But that will not take us anywhere unless we really focus on the national power, which this book has been focusing. I think some of those ingredients are actually great thing to ponder actually probably more deeply, some of those reform steps, some of those things that I would come back, especially on education. The NEP, and National Education Policy, which we have put up to 2020, which is a very path-breaking, kind of policy. But can we really implement it the way China has done for decades? Because again, we have also problem as well as advantage of federalism. This has to be again implemented by the states, and you have states, certain states we have already said that they will not implement. And then you have a central government which actually doesn't really deeply believe in federal aspects of So where do we actually really navigate in a kind of policy making? And the third and final thing I would say that we have also series of second and third generation of reforms which are actually pending, and that are actually bringing us down on many ways. It has made the state capacity, I would say, very feeble. Weak state capacity is a major roadblock. Look at just one example is about judicial reforms. The judiciary, the pending cases, millions of pending cases. Today, you have a chief justice who is fighting with the law minister about judicial infrastructure. You have, thousands of, subordinate courts do not have even houses, basic amenities, even for judges to sit and, hear the cases. So we are talking about, taking on China challenge, but look at some of our system and your judicial reform, the slowness in the judicial process drags down, if you go by some of the studies, 3 to 4% of our GDP suffers because of, these pending cases. Many of your disputes, other thing, including corporate disputes, other thing, contract, all those cannot be enforced because your judicial process is so slow and decades, backward in terms of digitization and other thing. So is India really ready to take on China challenge? I actually have serious, doubt. Probably, with this Atmanirbhar Bharat and all that is a fine for selling, scoring points for symbolism. But as your book says clearly, our trade relationship has only dependent grown, and it is actually going to grow. Our way of decoupling is a big dream, I think, because we simply do not have the wherewithal and probably the kind of will.
That's very helpful, because I had a sort of question for Ganesh on this. Earlier in the book, we talk about that the Chinese.
If I may come in at this moment and ask a question, which possibly could be a sequel to what Niranjan is talking about.
I'm sorry, I don't know who is speaking.
Gursharan,
Gursharan, please go ahead.
Right. So, in fact, we are looking at glass half full. So, let me look at glass half empty, which is the opportunity part. So, we have discussed enough, on the economic and the trade and all those fronts wherever India is lagging. So, but if we analyze in last 20 years how China's policy, both foreign as well as economic, has drifted during the 2000s, it was keeping a low profile and biding time. That was during Obama's. It moved from a country-oriented foreign policy, which some of the speakers have also talked about, to an issue-based during the Trump period. It is important that we understand the strategic contradictions here between the two countries, which is India and China, impacting bilateral issues. And during the current US dispensation, Biden, it is about accelerating and building of structures, not to contain, but at least strategically slow down China's rise. So given India's diplomatic proximity with the US and the strong diplomatic relations which Modi has built over the last 7-8 years with the influential economies of the world, should this not be taken as an opportunity for India? It's an open-ended question to the House. Who would like to take it? Ajit, let's start with you.
No, I mean, India, like I said, there's been a change. So since, for example, Ganesh mentioned the Quad. So we still need to understand whether how much strategic weight does Quad have. Is it only India trying to pull the weight, or because Australia and Japan did a few actions which raised some eyebrows. So the book talks about that we will have to build coalitions of these kinds with many, many other groupings. For example, the grouping consisting of countries in this part of the world, South Asia region. There may be an opportunistic alliance there. A grouping with all the democratic countries of the world, democracy being a strong value. So India is, trying to, and when I mentioned the vulnerability due to the dependency, we are doing, slowly moving in the direction where one example of the policy initiative is PLI, production linked incentives, to build domestic capacities, which will eventually reduce our dependency, diversify our sources away from China. I also must mention here, Gursharan, that we always think of China in defensive terms, that anti-dumping duty or excess capacity. We forget that China is a $6 trillion consumer economy. It's a $14 trillion GDP, 14-15, which consists of $6 to $7 trillion of consumer spending, twice the size. We never think of it, and I'm glad Ganesh is here because he's actually built a successful business exporting to China. He's actually earned money from China. The Tatas sell Jaguars and Land Rovers in China. TCS has a workforce of 5 or 10,000 people. I think Dr. Reddy's. So I could name several examples, Asian Paints. But why should we stop there? Why can't we look at China's consumer market as a huge opportunity for it? So unless if we are competitive enough, the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, said, "I am in China not because of cheap labor, because I can't find the talent elsewhere." iPhones get a revenue of $220 billion from China alone. And of course, what to speak of Mercedes. And so this is a very complex game. I mean, I think it's to strategically take advantage of the Chinese growing consumer market. Since I have a few minutes, and Bhuvana, with your permission, I'll need to leave at 8:30. We cannot conclude without me mentioning that while India is trying to do and meet this rising challenge, let's not forget that China is not static. And let me mention 4 or 5 vulnerabilities. We think of China as this sort of formidable, invincible sort of thing that we need to face. Number one, it's already been mentioned, growth is slowing down. 4%, even 4% may be good, an optimistic number. Second, productivity is slowing down. Third, aging workforce. Their workforce it's not just not growing, it's shrinking. That has resulted in higher labor costs. That's why they have to vacate those spaces which are being occupied by Vietnam and Bangladesh and other countries, which India should also occupy. Fourth, this growing tension between government and private sector. Large success stories like Alibaba and Financial, Didi, they are private sector success stories. But the government of China, for whatever in its wisdom, is taking pangas with the private sector. They don't want private sector to become powerful. And that spells, according to me, It's not good news for the future of China. Fifth, it is picking fight. They say you should not fight two front. You should not open war with two fronts. China has picked up skirmishes and frictions with multiple. Philippines, in the South China Sea, the US, Trump, continuing into Biden, India, Japan, what are those islands called? So multiple, it's picking up frictions with multiple countries. Now, I think Priyanka mentioned the BRI, I think the debt diplomacy, but there's a backlash now of the debt diplomacy. People are not happy about getting indebted to China, and they're actually going to possibly default on those debts. So let's not forget, all this is happening also in China. And of course, the last thing is social media. While there may be, the draconian controls and freedom of expression is highly restricted, but nobody can control this genie called social media. In fact, there is one theory that what happened in Galwan or the reaction thereafter is because their government is also now, what do you say in English? They're also now, under the control of having to satisfy more mobs on social media. So you can't, you just can't bottle up social media in China. So, and one more thing I want to mention on the Indian side, we need to distinguish between government-to-government relations and people-to-people relations. Chinese government is very different from people of China. So we should intensify the people-to-people contact, whether it is government, whether it's university to university, cultural, teachers exchange, student exchanges. I think we should, in fact, strongly encourage that. India invests very little in understanding China. When a visiting Chinese delegation comes, it's difficult to find a Chinese interpreter, Chinese language. Our universities should be spending hugely on Center for Chinese Studies, at least the language, the history, the culture, the ancient civilization. And of course, Chinese tourists are the number one tourists in the world. Outbound tourism before the pandemic was 137 million people annually. Biggest number in the world. How many come to India? 50,000. How do we know this? Because the visas are issued in Shanghai and Beijing. Can we not get at least 1% of the Chinese tourists to India? 1% of 137 million would be 1.37 million. Each of them spending $2,000 here is straight away about $2 billion of foreign exchange. And the Buddhist circuit, customize the Buddhist circuit for them. They'll be happy to, they shouldn't think of India as a dirty country, tourist unfriendly. It should be the other way. We should be opening tourism offices of course, this is the wrong time to talk about all these things, but these are the kind of strategic long-term things we should be thinking about. This is, of course, the mahal is not right because there's too much, garma garmi and social media, of course, that social media god is what we pay obeisance to. But these are strategically important things for India to do. So I'll need to step out. It's 8:30. But with your permission, Samir and Gursharan, and of course Ranjan, Priyanka, Dr. Aijaz, Sudipto, Ganesh.
Ajit, it's 8:28. So I think we'll give Aijaz at least 2 minutes before.
Yes, absolutely.
No, that's not fair. Should give you more time.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was an August gathering, and I got certain new pointers to research upon, especially when it comes to BRI and minority regions of China. So, sir, you talked about the economy, this debit diplomacy in BRI. In your book, you have written about the strategic patience, but how much patience we should have? The debit diplomacy has created much more vulnerability in Central Asia. And they are coming to us from year to year. From 2018, they have come to us many a time that please invest something in Central Asia. But look at our policymakers, what they are doing. Only we are having, when our external affairs minister visit that country, there will be some sort of news and some sort of policy making. But once he comes back, it once again becomes masterly inactivity in that area. Because I have been dealing with Central Asia from last 10 or 12 years. The Central Asia, where we can have strategic goodness or strategic appetite to deal with China, is the one of the best things after South Asia. Because that region, if we see the strategic deals and other deals with that region. We have many deals, but they did not go beyond a table in the MEA. They remain there for years, and once someone comes from Central Asia, then we think that we should do this and this. That is first problem. Second problem with China is, see, they have made their alliances with authoritative regimes. I have recently wrote a paper that how they silenced Muslim world on Uyghur issue. They have made alliances on the basis of authoritative regimes. If we see most of the Central Asian regimes or Pakistan or Turkey or Middle East regimes, they are authoritative in nature, and that is why they use their tilt towards authoritative regimes for their own purposes. On the other side, we now have CAD, like-minded countries, what we say, America, Australia, and other European countries. We need to have strategic partnerships with them to deal with China. I will give example of 2 days back. 2 days back, US said that we will diplomatically boycott Beijing Winter Olympics. And within 12 hours, New Zealand also boycotted it. Within 24 hours, Australia boycotted it. Australia boycotted the Beijing Olympics not on the basis of human rights violations in China, especially among Uyghurs. But they said that their prime minister said it is in our national interest. We are having problem with China, we should do it. Then came Canada. And today it was UK. But what India did, they will take time. See, if we have to go with the like-minded countries to deal with China, we have to do it within some time. We will take weeks together and then we will have some sort of that, okay, I don't think that we will go for this diplomatic boycott, but we should do it to keep like-minded countries in our favor. If we will not do it, so they will think that we are playing a dual policy. That is one problem. Second problem is, every country from last 3 years when this news of concentration camps was blown up by media, every country gave some sort of platform to Uyghurs. But what is our stand? Even now on Tibetans. That is, there we are having some strategic problem. We need to think on that. Okay, economic decoupling, we need to do it. See, America. I recently wrote an article of Global Times that this year American-China trade will break the records. But still, they are doing some strategic things to deal with China. But we are on वो क्या कहते हैं मूत mood. We are doing nothing. Third thing I will add on LAC. I have visited the Xinjiang in 2013-14. I have seen the infrastructure they have built, especially roads, railway lines, and airports on their side. And I have, with the help of Jabin Jacob sir, because I usually go to him, sir, help me here, I need some comment. I have recently written a paper. But if we see our side, now when it comes to Kashmir, from last 30 years, we cannot make a all-weather road. So anywhere we have a problem. We have to do some strategic thinking on it, that anywhere within our country we have a problem and how to deal with it. They need to do it within no time. But they will think that in next 3 years we will judge where our problem is. We are losing time now. Because we have to think smartly. And that is how we can checkmate China. And we do not need to worry about the rising trade with China, because it is our need. We are not having so developed infrastructure, so developed industrial system. That is our problem. We have to deal with it. Then we can checkmate China. Thank you, sir.
Ijaz, thank you so much for that. And that's near perfect time. I want to thank all of the panelists and the discussants who are able to join us, particularly Ganesh and Ajit for joining us and talking about the book. Sameerji, thank you for this opportunity. This was a wonderful way to bring the book to public attention. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
Very well moderated, and thanks everyone.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Bhuvna.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.